One of the most common questions I get right after "what pencil do you use" is what makes a good cover. I tend to think of both of these as subjective and prefer to focus on what makes a successful cover. To know what makes a successful cover, we need to identify our goals. First goal, is it eye-catching? Does it stand out on the shelf? A lot of comics are sold and read online. Does the cover stand out in those libraries as well? If not, is it primarily a design problem? We can use compositional elements to successfully solve this challenge. Things like silhouette, color, and rhythms. Silhouette is often the first thing we perceive from a graphic standpoint. The play of light against dark is usually what initially attracts a viewer to an image. Do the characters have a clear silhouette that is dynamic and identifiable? Color also plays a substantial role in attracting the eye. They can harmonize or be very jarring. My goal is to use color to create visual interest and mood, but not overload the viewer. Do the colors pop off the shelf, or are they muddy and compete too much with each other? Rhythms can tie an image together and create energy, both holistically and in individual elements. Do the rhythms guide your eye around the page? Does the composition hold your gaze? Are the characters explosive? Every cover starts as a graphic design problem. If it isn't interesting or eye-catching at this point, no amount of fancy detail or rendering is going to save it. I like to create a sense of the iconic by really focusing on silhouette and lighting. The shape of an element and how it is lit can tell the viewer a lot about how they are meant to perceive it. For instance, obscuring a figure with heavy shadow, a personal favorite of mine, can create a feeling of unease, while at the same time presenting an interesting design. These are things we've covered in earlier parts of this course, but the cover is where you pull out all the stops and push for the best, most engaging work possible. So make sure you hit your fundamentals. Second goal, does it meet the client's needs? Aside from making it eye-catching, it is important to know what the client is looking for in terms of logo placement and trade dress. Placing the title in the right or wrong place can make or break your cover. Make sure you have a template or know what the publisher needs in terms of logo and trade dress, size, placement, etc. But don't be afraid to propose an interesting variation on the design elements. Ask yourself, can they be incorporated into the composition? Sometimes it can be fun and exciting to include the logo right in the illustration as a physical item. I will often use templates from the publisher in my thumbnail process so that I don't back myself into a corner. Avoid placing important elements too close to the edges of the composition, but also watch out for the graphic elements. If you are going to overlap the title, do it clearly and with purpose. Slight overlap can create undesired tangents. Third goal. Does it tell a story? Storytelling is a difficult one. It's like describing how to tell a joke. Pick a key moment that captures the spirit of the story without revealing too much, and stage it in a clear and dynamic fashion. For instance, a fight between the hero and villain that puts our hero in dire but not insurmountable circumstances. I often start with the placement of my characters and the camera, what is called staging. I will sometimes even create a little floor plan for myself. Think of things like proximity, not only of the characters, but also of the camera. You can create a lot of tension by simply taking the air out of the room, closing the distance between all the elements. Also, you can create a sense of ease or anticipation by opening it up. Ask a question, or more specifically, get the viewer to ask a question. Something that compels them to pick up that comic to find out. You can have our hero backed into a corner with no apparent escape, or you could introduce some other mystery on the page. Who are these incapacitated soldiers lying at the feet of our protagonist? How did our hero get to this location? Why is there a purple gorilla on the cover? The question doesn't always have to be combat related, but that's definitely a go-to solution to get an exciting piece. Cover stories should punctuate with a question mark. A question that can only be answered by reading what's behind the cover, because the fourth and most important goal of a cover is to sell the book. So a lot of young artists, well heck, most any artist wants to figure out how to make their artwork better. But I want to start with things that we can do to avoid. The first one I want to talk about are tangencies. Tangencies are basically when two separate elements in an illustration come in and make an awkward touch. So for instance, if you've got two things coming in, they're just barely touching, that's a tangency, and it can create visual tension within an image or flatten image. For instance, if you're looking at a photograph and that photograph has a fence in the foreground next to a lake, and on the lake behind it there's a boat, and the bottom of that boat touches, from your perspective, that fence, it ends up looking like a toy boat sitting on a fence. These are the types of things that we want to avoid in an illustration. Whenever you're composing an image, try to avoid things coming up and just barely touching. Either push an overlap or create a space between the two. These are the ways that you can solve awkward tangencies. Now, some instances that you'll run into, you've got so many things coming in and overlapping and conflicting and creating visual contrast and tension. It's very, very difficult to plan all of that out. But that's also why we work through several steps of an illustration. In a thumbnail, you're working with large masses and big design elements, and it's easy to avoid those large tangencies. When you blow that image up a little bit larger, small detail-oriented tangencies all of a sudden can arise, and you also want to avoid those. So that's why we work from a very small, quick thumbnail to establish an idea and big macro design elements, working with the big silhouettes and big shapes. But then we also want to work into a tighter sort of mid-range, what I would call a rough for the illustration. And that's where you're working into the smaller elements of a piece and figuring out how any kind of small problems might arise, or the scale of the spacing that you might need that isn't always evident in a thumbnail. You'll often run into new problems as you start to scale an image up, because what you thought was a big enough space in a thumbnail ends up not being a big enough space in a larger drawing. Even in an instance like a character throwing a punch and hitting another character, you don't want to have that moment where the knuckles are connecting with the face. It freezes the image. It creates a static to the piece that freezes it in time. So you want to catch that follow throughs where the fist has passed the face and overlap clearly, or that moment before where it's coming up and it's about to hit and you get that balling up, that anticipation of the punch landing. Because we know if one thing is overlapping another, it's coming in front of it. Well, when you're doing a painting or a drawing, nothing is coming in front of anything. It's a flat piece of board or a flat screen or a flat piece of paper. But the second you get that overlap, you start to create the illusion of depth. And so you can take something that is a deficit and use it as an advantage in your own pieces. One of the big problems with illustration is that we are presented with the inherent problem of the fact that we're composing into a rectangle or a square. Well, the problem with that is that a square, if we look at it, has 4 arrows that point out of the composition, and that's your corners. My advice to you is just to avoid those corners in general. Essentially, trim those corners off. In a even better scenario, use graphic elements to picture corner your illustration, where you have some sort of an element coming in that essentially trims those corners off, like an old school photo album, maybe a hand coming in from out of the illustration, then it actually turns that corner, which inherently points out, to a hand holding a sword that points back into the illustration. So just like if you were trying to flee a room and there were a guy, at the door stabbing you back in with a sword, you're going to turn around and go back into the room, right? Same thing in an illustration. Anything that can push that eye back towards the center. As you're laying out the graphic design of your piece and you're looking for what energy do those shapes have? Where are they moving just as a graphic design shape? Where do those shapes point? Do they draw the eye towards the corners? Do they draw the eye around the image? Do they lead their eye out towards the right of the image, which is generally speaking the desired exit point for any illustration, because that's where you open the book. The binding is on the left, the opening is on the right. When the eye leaves, it's nice to have it leave out that right-hand side of the image and essentially into the book. I know that's probably overthinking it a little bit, but it's, to me, a really ideal composition is one that draws your eye towards the middle of the image, rebounding around the action, the narrative of the piece, and then eventually exits out the right-hand side of the illustration into the book. Composition is often the balance of unity and diversity. If things get too unified, meaning overly repetitive design within an image, it becomes very boring. It's like listening to, for those of you who even remember what this is, the busy tone on a phone. It's obnoxious and a repetitive noise that just kind of numbs you. And it's the graphic equivalent of the busy signal. Anytime you're repeating a rhythm or repeating a graphic shape or even repeating a color pattern, avoid that repetition. Take the camera and push it to the side and put it behind one of the characters and bring them up into the foreground, where maybe you don't even see their whole figure. All of a sudden they're just a head, shoulder, and arm coming in from the side of the composition. And then we have the bonus of picture cornering it. That guy coming in from the edge of the composition, he's killing that corner, he's taking up a larger piece of the illustration, and he's not such a generic human shape anymore either. Guess what? We can even overlap them. then we're getting rid of all three don'ts. We're getting rid of those tangencies by having them overlap. We're cutting off that picture corner by bringing that guy up into the front. And then we're even getting rid of that sameness of them being the same scale or same size. Push one into the foreground, push one into the middle ground, create that difference of scale, create that difference of shape, create that difference of value. You're winning on all fronts. You're eliminating a lot of don'ts in one shift of a camera position. All right, so now that we're starting to avoid these don'ts, let's talk about a few do's. We already talked about juxtaposing scale, so moving that camera behind one of the figures so that character is larger and comes up into the foreground. Our other character goes back into the middle ground. But we can also talk about positive and negative shape. Whenever you're laying out an image, you're going to have your three value breakup. You're going to have your dark, your middle, your light value, and that can be easily broken up into foreground, middle ground, background. What you do want to do is vary those shapes up. It's a way of avoiding that sameness. However you want to arrange things, arrange them to somewhat of a randomized degree. You don't want to have your middle axis and then have one shape the same distance from your middle axis as your other shape. You want to push one to the side and maybe shrink it down, push one towards the center and make it larger. Then you're starting to get into what's called a steelyard composition, where you're creating that balance of a smaller weight out at the end of a fulcrum, balancing out a larger weight nearer the fulcrum or the balancing point. That's a basic composition that you'll find in almost any book on composition. But it also starts to create that diversity and avoiding that sameness. How are you surrounding or framing your elements? Are you placing it in the exact middle of the image and having the element surrounding it being the same, equally weighted on all sides? Or do you think it's better to push it slightly to one side and down, or slightly one side and up, and balancing those things out? So using your negative shapes to also create some level of randomness within your image, so that you're not framing things equally on all sides. So our second do is creating a strong value separation or silhouette juxtaposition, however you want to phrase it, but breaking the infinite complexity of your image down to just three values: a dark value, a middle ground, and a light value. The most traditional way to do that would be if you have a landscape, you've got a line of trees up in the foreground and it's your dark shape, and you're simplifying it down into a very simple silhouette that is tree-like. Then you have your middle ground, which is a grassy field or some hills, and that's your middle tone value. And then you've got your light value, which is your sky. It's a very simple breakdown of your image, but when you start thinking of it that way, it makes it easy to compose your landscape. And the more you can break things up into those three value range, you're not even worried about drawing. You're just worried about the design process and how much depth you can get out of just those three values. And then as we take our drawing to more of a finish, we can start breaking down those three values into three values of their own. So you might end up with 9 values or 12 values in your finished illustration, where you've got your dark range and it has its own dark, middle, and light value. And then you have your middle range and it's got its own dark, middle, and light value. And then you've got your light values and it's got its own dark, middle, and light value. But try to keep it to those three values and focus on design through the initial phases of your illustration. And it's going to lead you to a much more successful image in the end. Our third do that we're going to talk about is a little bit more advanced, and that's creating movement in your illustration. And I don't just mean big movement. It doesn't always mean, throwing a big punch or throwing a big kick or flying through the sky. It doesn't always have to be these monumental moments. It can be small little bits of indicated or implied movement that can create a passage of time within your illustration. It can be a character's hair blowing. It can be a cape subtly blowing in the wind. It can be smoke blowing across the ground that creates the illusion of the passage of time. And even though it's a still image, you're implying that time passing by having something moving, and movement only happens with time. So the more you can imply that movement with just little hints within an image, because it's going to create, again, now a fourth dimension to your artwork. You not only have height, width, and depth, but now you have time. It can be on a large scale where you've got a character running, have that character completely off the ground. Say you're doing a Quicksilver cover. Have those feet, man, no part of his body should be touching anything else. And it's just purely his momentum that is carrying him through space, and it creates action and excitement and dynamics to an image that will also excite the viewer when they're looking at it. If a character is wearing a cape, that cape should never just hang straight. It should be blowing in the wind. If a character has long hair of any kind, it doesn't even have to be long hair, the wisps of hair should be blowing off to the side. So anything like that that's creating motion, even an emotion, an expression on the face, creates movement because your face has to move to create an expression. Don't just have the teeth gritted or just the blank expression on the face. A dynamic expression, even just a slight raise of the eyebrow, can be very dynamic. So try to create that motion as much as you can. It doesn't always have to be a figure. Sometimes it can be environmental. I'm a big fan of the blowing mist or blowing smoke for many different reasons. A, it can start to create depth in your illustration by knocking that background back to a middle value through the mist, but it also can create that movement of smoke blowing across the ground, or push one form in front of another by having the smoke blow between them. And the more you can leave those little hints throughout an image, the more your image will become authentic and impactful to the viewer. Sometimes I tell my students that being an artist is a little bit like being a supervillain, and that you're leaving clues on purpose to the hero because it's the pursuit that you love. And so that's kind of, you're the villain and the viewer is the hero, and you're leaving him little clues or her little clues for them to follow along and unravel your crime, and the pursuit begins. You know, the hair blowing in the same direction as the mist is blowing, or the corner of their cape twirling up and creating that same movement. And all of a sudden it creates, again, that passage of time where you're leaving little clues to the viewer that's going to lead them where you want them to go. So be that supervillain, leave those clues, create that motion, and good luck creating some compelling images.
Anybody can learn how to make comics, but if you want to learn from Marvel pros, check out the rest of the course at proko.com/Marvel. We have more free lessons that will help you on your journey and let you peek into the course to decide if it's right for you. Once you go premium, we'll teach you scripting, drawing and inking techniques, how to make environments, comic covers, and more. There's so much to learn if you want to make good comics, and this course will set you on your path to make your own. See you in the course.